2024 and the second anniversary of Russia's war brings a feeling of uncertainty for Ukrainians and their supporters. This period has seen a significant mood shift influenced by factors beyond the tactical outcomes of Ukraine's summer counteroffensive. Russia has proved adept at deforming the narrative around Ukraine's resistance to its aggression and the amplification of so-called war fatigue. But the ultimate objective for Russia is to influence fundamental beliefs and alliances, disrupt democratic values, the rule of law, and institutions that maintain the democratic order. My guest today argues that through its hybrid informational warfare measures, it's potentially able to render international justice meaningless and facilitate the collapse of the current architecture of international law. Welcome to Silicon Curtain. Please like and subscribe and definitely comment on the videos to help them perform better in YouTube and help people find the incredible guests that we feature. Also, please check out the validated Ukrainian charities that appear in the description of the video, especially Superhumans, which is an incredible venture rehabilitating servicemen who have and women who have lost limbs in helping to resist Russian aggression. Armenak Ohanesian is a head of legal studies at the Institute for Conflict Studies and Analysis of Russia in Kiev. He is the 2024 non-resident fellow for the Irregular Warfare Initiative at Princeton's Empirical Studies of Conflict Project and Modern War Institute at West Point. But I will ask him to do a proper introduction and give us more up-to-date information. Welcome to the channel.
Thank you very much, Jonathan. Hi, everyone, and thank you very much for this brilliant introduction. I'm not sure if I deserve it because there is nothing actually to add more to this introduction. Just a little bit more about my background. I've been practicing law for 12 years in Kiev and a bit abroad. So I have a glimpse on understanding of how international law works and how usually Russians behave and what is, I would call it, Soviet tactics of behavior, which is rooted in KGB technologies and KGB approach to that offensive neglection of any principles of international law. So also I have a short period of war fighting. I've been mobilized in February 2022, and I was decommissioned in 2023. And since then, I run with my colleague, Alex Shulga, ICAR Institute for Conflict Studies and Analysis of Russia. We do surveys of the Russian population, and I try to interpret these data we obtain through legal prism.
And this experience of actually, seeing and countering Russian aggression firsthand, serving your country, has that sort of added to the ideas that you already had? The concept of how Russia's war is fought on many fronts.
Yeah, actually, it has, because when we were at Kharkiv Oblast, I had a chance to visit Russians' trenches, and what we found there is quite controversial. On the one hand, you find religious texts, you find different recommendations on how to behave, on how to shape the attitude of an average soldier to their enemy, how not to feel any moral constraints while attacking like Slavic people, because obviously Russian propaganda refers to Ukrainians as Slavics too, and the narrative is also that we are brothers, and this is a bit controversial. That's Orwell's sort of double thing, because from the one hand, these are your brothers, on the other hand, you have to kill them. So that was quite interesting to read those writings, I would say so. And on the other hand, you can find different unusual stuff there. So even up to sex toys in their trenches. So, and I think that's reflection of, globally speaking, their split consciousness, which is actually one of our focuses in our studies and our social studies, because that's what Orwell's doublethink is coming true.
And it's a topic that I went into in some detail with Peter Pomerantsev, who is one of the authors and thinkers who very early on wrote about this extraordinary dissonance in Russia. You know, on the one hand, you'll have the narratives that it's a country of moral values, it's the third Rome, it's the savior of humanity, etc. It exudes or tries to exude a kind of strength or a facade of strength and values and so on. But when you look behind it, and this metaphor of looking in the literally an abandoned trench of a genocidal ragtag army, and then finding all these clues to different identities, and even within the same people, things that are entirely contradictory. That contradictoriness, is that a key part, do you think, not just of the Russian identity, but also its propagandistic method?
Absolutely. I absolutely agree with this statement, because effectively Russians are not a monolith nation. I believe that that is the root of this schizophrenia, if you will, in at that social level, because what constitutes so-called Russian nation now is just a compound, society from different cultures, beginning from Buryatia up to border of Finland, and it's impossible to make them a single nation without forcefully destroying their culture. And the substitution for their culture was like Soviet moral, and Soviets had nothing rather than strength, beginning with Khrushchev's statements when he was, arguing that they're the superpower and global power. So basically, their so-called strength is rooted in the fear, and that fear just suppressed anything individualistic, which is what each of the nations, within Russian territory has. So, and I think that we have recent examples in Bashkiria, that riots, they were suppressed quite instantly, and that not to speak of Wagner's mutiny. That's again a perfect example of what's going on and what to expect from any social movement. And I think that is the main root of this schizophrenia, I would call it. So, because literally in clinical psychiatry, it's called schizophrenia because there is it's split consciousness. It's the same process just happening at the social level.
And there's an extraordinary video which I saw over the weekend, which is of Wagner fighters essentially taking revenge on I would say sort of standard ministry troops or a standard army.
Mhm.
Uh, there's been some kind of conflict. A Wagner soldier was hurt by regular soldiers, and then the Wagnerites came back and sought revenge. And it's not the violence itself that's interesting here. It's just the simple lack of any values, common values between these people. Violence seems to be the only common currency, or I even call it a cultural currency, that they all seem to recognize as a binding force. Listening to their conversation, and it's a really horrific 20-minute clip, you know, they make various appeals. Each of them make various appeals to something or other, but it's very fragmented, and it's clear they don't really have any common cultural values that can, well, prevent them almost killing each other.
Yeah, exactly. That's the consequence, I guess, of this cult of violence. They lack empathy at all, so they just can't feel any, warm feelings to their brothers in arm, and like I said, that's a direct consequence of living culturally under influence of violence, total influence of violence. So, and speaking of violence, it's impossible to become a part of international community if you cannot cooperate. And that is actually the main explanation of misuse of literally all tools at the international level, economical, legal, whatever you name it.
And of course, the propaganda, we'll turn to lawfare in a second, because I think it's incredibly fascinating how they're managing to manipulate the international environment. Obviously, money plays a key role in that, money and resources. But also, we started the video talking about some of the unfortunate successes of Russian propaganda, and that is the amplification of a so-called war fatigue, which is very much apparent not in Ukraine supporters. You won't find any of them. People are tired, but they're not fatigued. I think there's a very different thing. It's very much something that is a media creation. It's something also that politicians, some of them seem to express, but it is also something that Russia has been seeking to amplify. Another direct consequence of Russian propaganda narratives is, of course, the pause in provision of munitions and material from the US, holding up funding there. So rather than talking about the actual impact on the front lines, I think we're all fairly aware of what that is now. How does Russia manipulate narratives in the media and behind the scenes in international relations to actually influence the two examples we're talking about, which have a very significant impact on the conduct of the war itself?
Well, that issue is complex, and it's not even possible to cover it in a long-hour video conversation. Uh, I would say that they're trying to adopt in each specific case their techniques to reach the target audience as the better they can, as the best they can. I mean, if we are talking about supplies and armament procurement, they have established already like economic connections, which they disrupt by bribing, by different other techniques, by putting pressure on the families of some politicians, by blackmailing them. If we are talking about their supplies, they are just seeking for different sideways to get those supplies, because as we can see the last year, the supplies from Kazakhstan and Kyrgyzstan have increased incredibly, like 5 or 6 times. So that's really the indicator that they're trying to reach. They are, I'd say, anthropocentric. They are not trying to elaborate any specific strategy which will like work for literally each and every jurisdiction, each and every society. They are trying to build the chains and to intervene in those chains of supplies, of decision making, and to target the key decision makers, to target key personalities who are just making those decisions, and that's it. That very much resembles Chinese approach to the soft power, to the quite famous three warfare strategy, because they are not dividing like in the US, for example, different warfighting domains. That here we have information warfare, here we have electronic warfare, etc., cyber warfare, etc., etc. They are focusing on the goal very much, and the goal depends on people who make the decisions. And I think that the FSB and all their secret services are working to get as many information as possible about specific personalities and to target them, because we also can witness how they exploited those like corruption cases. For example, in Ukraine, obviously Ukraine is not the most transparent country in the world, but the point of propaganda is always to take small truths and to make it like a global thing. And that what Russians are doing. And moreover, they're targeting US officials through that propaganda. They're just trying to push different, literally irrelevant narratives on global connections between US officials with literally everyone in the Europe and in particular in Ukraine, so, which is obviously not true. But that affects people, that creates tensions, that creates suspicious environment within European Union, within NATO alliance, and of course that does not benefit the integrity and the international security. I mean, in the resistance to this Russian aggression.
And you've been examining Russia's military doctrine in this context as well. What role or what level of importance does irregular warfare play within the overall Russian military doctrine, as far as we can understand? I imagine a lot of it is secret, of course. And out of that hybrid warfare, what role is lawfare playing?
That's a very interesting question, and it has different aspects. The first aspect is that there is actually not much publicly available information, but what we can witness that the doctrine had been elaborating since 2016, which is far after they took the Crimea. But we have the signs of shift in their approach to the irregular warfare since 2013, when Gerasimov began to elaborate more on irregular warfare tactics. But his pilot article, it was printed in 2016, and since then it established the tradition of their secretive plans, so-called пятилеткас, five-year plans. And my take, and the second aspect is that what is publicly available, it has an element of deception. They deliberately just indicate what is not true, what does not reflect what they are going to do. And the deeper you go, the more academic studies you read, I mean, of Russian warfare academia, it becomes clearer that what is officially available is complete deception. Because if you are reading like the definitions what Gerasimov provides, it's really nothing specific, and it's really overbroadly definitions, and you cannot elucidate crystallize any specific idea. But when you are reading like their academia, which refers to regular or informational warfare, you begin to realize that they try to combine quite unusual domains, which differs from the Westerners' approach. By saying that, I mean, for example, they include in the informational warfare electronic warfare, which is really unusual, but the studies indicate that specific techniques, I mean, technological solutions, they can affect the mental health of the troops, including troops at the battlefield. And it is also no secret that they are trying to adopt their electronic warfare equipment to meet and to counter the efforts of the equipment which is supplied by the partners to Ukraine. So just a quick example, if Starlink was working perfectly last year, so this year, as far as I know, the jamming stations Russian jamming stations are completely disrupting the connection. Even the measures are undertook, the same measures which were undertook a year ago. So that is clearly a sign that they are not just, adopting. They're doing research, and they're thinking how to overtake. And so that's bringing us to another point, that's crucial not to underestimate, their technological solutions and the effectiveness of their approach. And really what is able to counter it is applying that multidisciplinary approach to the warfare too, not trying to divide between different warfighting domains, but try to combine them to create a holistic strategy. in countering that.
And this is an area, I think, where Ukraine, and this is the reason why this channel was created, really, was to try and disseminate what Ukraine is doing. The fact Ukraine is, I would say, gone beyond partisan politics because survival is very much an existential manner, and you see Ukrainians are, you know, united as never before, but also united on grounds of language, culture, common identity. They're united around a set of values which transcend politics and provide a certain level of immunity, or at least a foundation from which counter disinformation has some chance of success. It seems that in the West we are far less united around common culture, and certain issues are able to drive a wedge between people, whether it is culture war, identity issues, Brexit, Trump, etc. There are wedge issues which Russian propaganda is effectively leveraging to create disunity amongst ourselves. So do you see this and the other aspect, of course, is you're talking here about needing to have a holistic attitude, have different disciplines and different experts kind of work together to spot where they can unite to counter Russian techniques. Do you see one of the weaknesses of the West at the moment and our response to Russia in that we are very, very siloed? The media treats all these different conflicts going on as siloed, it treats the issues as siloed, and to an extent, there are many experts that are still doing the same and not collaborating across disciplines.
Uh, yeah, of course, there could be different ways, but the crucial route is to, I'll say sanction, sorry for this buzzword, but to sanction those voices that are spreading deliberately malign disinformation. And there are lots of them across the world. That's not a secret. So, and it's not too complicated task to trace the sources. It's not complicated task to trace the sources of fundings, and sometimes they lead to quite unusual personalities or jurisdictions, but still that has to be done. And going back to the beginning of your question that there is less unity than, amongst Western world than a year ago or a decade ago when it was World War II or World War One, the aftermath. That's really complicated in the sense of I think that in today's world, that globalistic approach has exhausted itself already. And adversarial countries like Russia and China, they are trying to leverage that, like you mentioned. So instead, it has to be elaborated sort of resilience umbrella, cognitive resilience umbrella, which will allow to reestablish those values, to remind people what the values were and why they matter. And what we can witness, for example, in Baltic states, in Poland, and effectively in countries which have common border with Ukraine or Russia, they understand these values quite perfectly because the main value is the life and health of their own citizen. And they perfectly realize that if Russia overtakes Ukraine, the next will be them. And the far problem is the less you mention it, the less it bothers you. So it's crucial, it's crucial to underline that these values are not just empty words like democracy. Sorry for saying that, but what it is compound of, what are the true values? If you value the life of your family members, you have to be united. And Ukraine has very sad examples of how people lose their families because of Russian aggression, unmotivated aggression. And on And the other point is that there is no need to, I'd say, debunk the propaganda narratives. You have to substitute them with beneficial narratives, I would say, so to counter those malign narratives with beneficial ones.
That's exactly the conclusion I've come to after 2 years of investigating this as well. Yeah, fact checking definitely doesn't work. It just adds to the disorientating effect of propaganda. And you write fascinatingly in the article here about the objectives of hybrid warfare. If, for instance, say in the 1960s, whether it be the CIA or the sort of GRU, often having sort of insurrections or mounting coups was a way of destabilizing countries and etc. But you talk about Russian warfare and indeed lawfare as having a far more perhaps pernicious role here, and that is that they target the governance of a state, the ability to actually govern a country, with any degree of stability. So they're not trying to push necessarily one regime or another, but perhaps trying to make their adversaries ungovernable, trying to turn them into sort of basket cases, which is one of the political objectives of hybrid warfare.
Yeah, absolutely. The point is they delivered the law, and their attitude, their tactics, and at the operational level, they just try to compromise the governments by demonstrating to their population that their governments are incapable of decision-making process, that they are like either corrupt, either they are incapable of, like I said, making any credible decisions, and the decisions are bad for the population. And in each specific case, they just try to find that sensitive narrative which will work. So, and when they notice how they work at the international level, at the UN Security Council, they are not actually explaining the background of their decisions. They're just referring to UN Charter. They're just telling the ideas they want to deliver, and that's it. If that would be the reasoning at the court, it wouldn't stand any critics, and it wouldn't work on the judge. But in this case, we have a community, international community. There is no single judge or panel of judges, so it's impossible to provide a specific counter arguments to a specific individual, and that's the problem. So, as you probably know, I argue that nowadays the lawfare, and I dislike this term, and I'm going to talk about this a bit later, is concentrated on countering efforts, malign efforts in purely legal sense, but mostly international law is also about communication. It's about what messages are delivering certain actors at the international scene. And again, I can reiterate that since international law is also a way of communication, I mean the countries and Ukraine and its partners have to counter these messages with relevant ones. And even if Russians are trying to compromise the existing international institutions, since we don't have any other ones, we have to protect what we have. And speaking of terminology, lawfare is quite controversial term in the sense of it can mean as well as countering, which I described, and as well as malign use of law. And to reduce it to the quite classical terms of legal theory, that malign misuse of law is just abuse of law, and that's it. So there is no need actually to distinguish. The law remains the law, and the rules are quite universal. And as long as they're being distorted by belligerent state, belligerent actor, that has to be like fixated in the moment and delivered to the community that we have like specific breach, and this breach means that they break. This is a breach not only of specific norms, it is a breach of customary rules. It is a breach of the principle. So, of course, I support the idea of natural law, and of course, I believe that there is a core and that transcendent, I would say, core of the law, and speaking of that root, that doesn't mean actually that social theory means nothing. Of course, since we have the principle of sovereignty, each actor is sovereign and in full power within its territory, other states have to respect it. But since one country attacks another, I think it's time to rethink the hierarchy of those principles. And if we have, for example, the crime of aggression, which was effectively established by all international justice institutions, I think there should be a sort of emergency treaties which should express like very straightforwardly express that change in hierarchy of sovereignty and of those principles like sovereignty and the right, for example, for self-defense, which is also envisaged in UN Charter, because that right to self-defense was exploited by Putin in his announcement of invasion on February 24. And I think that was a major loss for international legal community, just for condemning it, and that's it. Because that effectively undermined the meaning of international law. And that's it. And I think that constitutes the very beginning of their complete disregard of rules and established procedures.
And that's an interesting point here, isn't it? Because if we look back to the Soviet Union signed up to all sorts of international conventions and then selectively chose which ones to implement and which not. And of course, it ignored a lot of the human rights stuff, but it at least made the pretense of trying to be, well, it made the pretense of being part of the international order and trying to shape it from the inside. Do we not now see a very different Russia? And this is one which again uses legalistic language and instruments and pretends that is part of that system, but their actual, I mean, they don't seem to adhere to any of the precepts and words that they're sort of throwing out. Is it a conscious effort to make the entire system nonsensical, not to replace it with something else, not to build an alternative system, which would be a lot of hard work, but to simply hollow it out and make a mockery of the current system to the point where nobody believes anymore in those kind of gestures or the theater of law, as it were?
Well, that's really interesting question, and I have not an answer to it. My take is that from the one point, if you approach to try to comprehend it from the rational standpoint of view, and also it's a big mistake to think that Russians' lack of rational or critical thinking would be a great mistake. But if you try to comprehend it from this point of view, it makes no sense, because since you don't have any replacement to the architecture which you are trying to destroy and even let you destroy it, so it will lead to a total war. And the total war means that Russia will be destroyed in like hours, and the world will be destroyed in hours. And Actually, it makes completely no sense. On the other hand, we can witness that often decisions of Putin and Russians officials, and I don't think that this aggression is tied up exclusively to Putin. That's rather a feature inherently like it's inherent for those decision-making circle, which had been formed in the Soviet times in Russia, and just it migrates through ages. And if we try to analyze their decision-making, it's often is irrational. So of course you can. We also have to elaborate on that scenario when irrational decisions would be made, and for example, they just will make a decision to nuke any of the countries, and of course that will have no rational substantiation, like I said, but it will have tremendous consequences. And there is a quite interesting idea of gradual escalation, and that Russia trying to leverage this idea. I mean, knowingly, they increase that pressure, those tensions, but up to the point when they understand that the conflict is inevitable, and then they just drop the things up and just go back to the initial point. And we also can witness that, and there is something in that idea. I mean, of course, they understand that collectively NATO would just destroy, like I said, Russia within hours. And that explains their idea of undermining the value of NATO. And unfortunately, some of Western officials are echoing this idea, are supporting it for political or maybe for economical reasons, no matter, but it works.
And that, of course, we just have to mention the upcoming US election and the risk of, I would say, further erosion of the unity within NATO that may be the result of one of those candidates winning. And we can certainly see how that would benefit Russia. And what benefits Russia, one might not know the role they've played fully. Only history perhaps will be able to tell that. But, my assumption is that if Russia benefits, then they may well have had a hand in bringing that situation about. Another aspect that you've really put a lot of emphasis on when it comes to legal conventions, and it's, to me at least, been deeply shocking how little media attention is spent on this, and that is the absolute and complete insignificance of the Geneva Conventions to the Russian military, both to its doctrine and also to its practices. And that's not just on the battlefield. It's, what they do in the occupied territories. It's what they do in areas that have recently been taken or occupied. It's even in the effects of their electronic warfare and warfare against infrastructure, all of which are absolutely diametrically opposed to all the conventions of war. And yet somehow they seem able to mute conversations around this, despite the absolutely sort of glaring and intentional inhumanity of their military strategy and practice.
Yes, that's absolutely, I agree, and that is perfect point. I'll just start with an example that Russians had never have any policy documents on civilian harm mitigation or collateral damage, which means they didn't think of it, actually, contrary to NATO countries. And of course, that's obvious that during the warfare, there will be a civilian harm. So to comply with Geneva Conventions, you have to elaborate policies, you have to train your troops to mitigate those harm, to decrease it as much as possible. And since Russians don't have these documents, they just don't pursue this issue. It is not an issue for them at all. And moreover, I would say that those examples you point out just demonstrate that they deliberately attack civilians, and that is their target often, and not the troops. And those statements that they were targeting only military objects is complete, deception. And what we actually have witnessed multiple times when they hit just hospitals, they hit electronic plants, and etc., which just is a civilian infrastructure. So I think that point is that the Russians are already into that total war position, and they have already disregarded all that international architecture, and the Western world just perceives that formal obedience and formal, just the signature on the papers accepts as a consent, a crucial point to enter any treaty, any international agreement. And just the behavior of Russia demonstrate that they never gave that consent. They gave it only formally, and they did not have any intent to obey it. And like I said, so what I see as a lawyer is probably sort of emergency treaties. But this is a logical circle because, again, it will require consent, which effectively will have no meaning for the Russians. So that is much thought food for war pundits and decision makers rather than purely lawyers. That's why I'm talking about interdisciplinary approach.
And this is a problem that we, in the media, still, and despite all of the evidence, treat Russia in some ways as if it's a part of the international system, a part of the legally based international system, but it's one that's just sort of strayed away from, or, it just happens to, break certain legalistic conventions, where in actual fact, do we have to look at Russia as a completely different entity, something outside of the international legal framework, something that is a state that is inherently has a culture that is pre-legal, one that does not have rule of law or any foundations as such, or even any comprehension of why these things should be more important than power or the expediency of its rulers, etc. Are we looking at Russia in completely the wrong way, both militarily but also legalistically?
Probably yes, but since we don't have any, since we don't have any counterparty to talk to refer to, I mean, not Ukrainians, but the world community, while trying to deter these actions, Russians' actions, we have to communicate to them. And that is why I'm saying that international law is much about communication. On the other hand, those international or intra-state entities, it's also a part of globalistic approach, which is not supported much in the world, and it's became a quite speculative topic. So I would be careful with this, because this idea itself could undermine from the inside the idea and the whole architecture of international law by trying to appeal to these kind of entities, like you say. That's a logical fault within your own created system. So I would say that that's an interesting approach, but it has to be elaborated more. And my take is that those international values could be the background for creation of those entities. It's not necessarily a state. It's not necessarily an international organization or non-governmental organization, but that is that core of values which means being a human, I'd say so.
There's a fascinating idea in your paper here, which I think I barely sort of understand, but I think is really interesting. And this is the idea that Russian aggression is not simply targeting the things that we can see and the things we're familiar with, which is infrastructure, military objectives, etc. That actually its information warfare is very specifically designed to damage the cognition, the mental health, and to fracture the worldview of civilians. It's specifically designed to damage people and erode their sort of beliefs in institutions and so on, and the values they previously held, including debasing the value of freedom. I mean, this is so extraordinarily pernicious that I think people find it very difficult to believe that Russia's doctrine is actually to harm them. This is a line that Keir Giles uses a lot, which is, you may not be interested in Russia, but it is interested in you, and it is coming to get you as well, is the more paranoid interpretation of that.
Yeah.
So how far is this cognitive attack or erosion part of Russia's doctrine, and how can we counter it? How can we create cognitive resilience, as you describe in your paper?
Well, as far as those military doctrines are not publicly available, and what is available is a deception, like I said, it's difficult to estimate all the tools they have to affect the cognition of their targets. But it's not secret that they doing different experiments in, like I said, combining different warfighting domains. And to counter it, indeed, the resilience is a crucial word and the crucial idea for countering that cognitive attacks. Because there are, if we notice the psychological state of Ukrainians during the war, sometimes it can lead to a thought that people are depressed in some sense. And I think that that is the result of this strategy of cognitive warfighting. And just to counter it, you have to elaborate your own strategy, which would spread like benevolent cognition, which would affect in a positive way on mental health of the population. And the same, of course, refers to Western world, because if we notice how Russian propaganda behaves, they're trying to pick the most negative news. They're trying to to underline the worst things that are happening, and to create an image that is total, that is global. And to the contrary, I think that, again, that multidisciplinary approach could help, because, again, when state policies, including the countering propaganda, will be elaborated in cooperation with doctors, with psychotherapists, it will be of much, if these programs will include like simple techniques of critical thinking, will include simple techniques of relaxation, that would be of great help, and both for civilians, both for troops. And I think that that's a huge work, but it has to be done immediately, because again, Russians, like I said, they are quite anthropocentric in warfare, in their warfare. That even those economic goals, even those political goals, they are interim stages to targeting specific individuals. And again, targeting cognition, you target the individual effectively. And even if you don't, it's even, I would say, worse than killing, than murdering. So,
And yeah,
yeah, please.
and that effort also is designed not to necessarily make you believe in something like an ideology, but is to prevent you from taking action, coalescing with other people, organizing yourselves, creating not just individual resilience, but sort of group resilience against its aggression. In your view, is a lot of this actually very much designed to prevent people from organizing in order to resist Russian aggression?
I wouldn't say so, and that is the point we have to exploit. That is the point we have to concentrate on, and that is the proper background to build these strategies of cognitive resilience, I think. Because
And
being united, it's easier to counter these narratives rather than individual.
so, of course, they're going to try and prevent that. The last question, this is something that I think emerges from your report as well, which I found very interesting, and that is the use of electronic warfare, and in particular things like phishing attacks to try and get information. So we think of hacking attacks, phishing attacks as very much something designed to break systems, disrupt them, introduce viruses. We see them as quite sort of destructive. But you've pointed out here that actually they can be far more effective in some ways than the way Russia is using it, and that many phishing attacks are actually to generate information or find out information, understand, connections between people and systems and organizations, which can then later be used for propagandistic effects. I think this is a little understood or studied outcome of Russia's sort of hybrid cyber warfare.
Yes, indeed. It's not quite well explored, as well as not only it refers to Russia, but that's globally evolving like field of knowledge. And of course, I avoid mentioning AI, but the large language models are capable of creating quite credible images. Imagine you are in the front line and you hear your commander's voice to surrender. Imagine you are sitting in your in your room and talking to a person and believing you are talking to your colleague, but it's just a deepfake technology. And these are actually not, this is not a science fiction. There are specific instances of exploitation of these techniques. And I don't think that Russians succeed in this very much, uh, unlike China. And so far, but of course they are trying to exploit, they will try to exploit it too, because at this moment the deep fakes technologies and etc., that aspect of electronic warfare is at the level of memes yet. But who knows what we will see in 1 month, because these technologies are evolving extremely rapidly. So, and again, the resilience techniques, cognitive resilience techniques, they could also counter these attacks, these assaults as well. Because because when a person is thinking critically, the person can technically check specific aspects of communication channel, and the person has less is less affected by emotional states, and Russians often appeal to the emotions, not to the rational cognition. I think that being combined, this could render these efforts like futile.
This is absolutely fascinating. I think we sort of run out of time. There's plenty more to explore there. And I think you've opened up the avenue there for a future conversation, which is that even when Russia loses on the battlefield, um, everything you've talked about here suggests that actually the hybrid version, the informational version of this warfare and the use of lawfare will not end at the same time. It's part of a multi-pronged approach which doesn't necessarily need to have a military component. It does at the moment, but it's something that will continue almost incessantly. And you've also highlighted that once developed, these techniques aren't exclusive to Russia. They can be used by China, Iran, or any other kind of malign actor. They can also be used in a commercial context as well for, unscrupulous entities that want to take advantage of sort of legal frameworks and normal ways of communicating and organizing and subvert them. But this has been absolutely fascinating. Armenak, I'm very pleased that you're able to join us.
It's
Uh,
all my pleasure. And Jonathan, thank you very much for inviting me. And indeed, I hope that this opens an avenue for further discussions in this topic. And thank you very much. And I appreciate your work because that's really important. The coverage of the issues related to the war. And as we see, it refers to globally to the world.
Thank you so much, and Slava Ukraini.
Героям слава!